Okay, in the tutorial, I'm going to help you consider this exam question. Now, this exam question is a really common exam question. It's where you need to start using your geographic knowledge and everything you've learned on a topic area to answer an explain question. Now, it does say possible factors, so you don't have to worry too much about being absolutely precise as long as you have 4 explanations that cover the question. Now, in this case, we've got a variation in land uses on our two sides, okay? And we've got a north-facing side to our valley and a south-facing. Now, that's been established across the previous questions. And we can see that there's a noticeable difference in land uses. So what's the first reason? Well, when you think about the north and the south, what are we really talking here? We're talking about solar insolation or solar insolation. So that's the amount of radiation from the sun that a north-facing slope receives compared to a south-facing slope. And that's to do with the orientation of the sun relative to the slope in the northern hemisphere. Now, we know from our study of glacial landscape features like corries that they tend to form on north-facing slopes because north-facing slopes receive less solar insolation and therefore are cooler, and that's why corries form. Well, that's why glaciers form, which leads to corries forming. Now, that same rule applies to land use. So we have to accept that our north-facing slope is receiving less solar insolation, so it's going to be cooler, and a cooler slope will therefore be more likely to be difficult to cultivate various things. So, for example, agricultural crops growing in fields are going to find it more difficult on a slope that's receiving less solar insolation. Okay, so that would be the first area we could explore. Okay, now the second factor is to do with wind direction. So I'm going to have a look at our map here. And here's our north-facing slope, and here's our south-facing slope. Sorry, our north-facing slope's this way, and our south-facing slope's this way. Now, wind direction in the UK comes from the southwest, so it comes from here across that way. And that's going to have an impact on a variety of things. For example, during the Ice Age, it would have impacted on the fact that the snow is less likely to blow away on north-facing slopes. That's here because the hill would be sheltering that slope, and therefore the snow is going to build up in layers much easier. Whereas the winds, the southwesterly winds, would have blown the snow away on the south-facing slopes because of the prevailing wind. Well, if we apply that same logic about wind direction to, in this case, land use, we have to think how could that influence land use? How could wind cause one area of a landscape to have more of something? For example, forestry. Why might we be putting more forestry on our southwest slopes? And that might be to do with the fact that, south-facing slopes, because the wind's more current on the south-facing, it's more likely to be hit. And trees can withstand, especially coniferous trees, like we see here, windier slopes. Whereas on our north-facing slope, we've got more deciduous plantation and possibly some other land uses, because these are more sheltered and therefore are more likely to be able to thrive in a more sheltered environment. So we could bring that along with anything else that we want to refer to land uses where the wind might be a factor or might not be a factor. So water sports on this side of the loch are going to rely on wind, for example, especially if you've got sailing boats. Whereas on the south facing, which is going to be the north facing, which is going to be more sheltered on this side of the valley, might be less suitable to things like sailing. Okay, so there's a couple of ideas. Let's think about what else could be. Okay, our third idea is linked to our second idea to do with winds. Now, whilst a south-facing slope, it's going to be more difficult for snow to accumulate because of the consistent wind compared to a north-facing slope, which is more sheltered, which allows the snow to accumulate. The southwesterlies, for example, during the Ice Age, would have brought warmer air from the further south, meaning that south-facing slopes would be warmer because of the warmer air blowing with the southwesterly winds. You've got to think about a southwesterly wind being a tropical maritime wind, which is going to be warmer because it comes from the tropics, which would more likely make snow melt compared to the cooler winds on the north-facing slopes, which would be more likely to be polar or Arctic winds. Now, let's apply that logic to land use. So the difference in wind temperatures and therefore the temperature of those two sides, how would that influence different land uses and activities on our two sides? If I'm, for example, staying in a holiday chalet, I'm going to want to feel a warmer wind than a cooler wind, more than likely. Or if I'm thinking about farming, um, that's also going to be a factor. So that's our third factor. Now let's think about one more factor. Now, in our next factor, we have to actually think about why we have the land uses that we actually have. What is our altitude? And we can see that on our north-facing slope, we've actually got some pretty high areas. So we're rising, we can see 250, contour 3, we're 400 meters. So we've actually got a higher altitude on this side than on this side of our valley, okay? And higher altitudes are clearly going to be cooler. And for example, on this side, during an ice age, I'd expect more corries to form because the temperatures are cooler at these higher altitudes, and therefore snow's less likely to melt. Well, similarly, in a modern day, that's going to have an influence on land uses that we get on our two sides. And another key factor we need to bring in whilst we have this map up is we can see that we have far more steeper slopes on our north-facing side than we do on our south-facing side. So that's going to have an influence over the land use, in this case, the stability of soil. So there's less likely to be soil forming. If we thought about the Ice Age, because we're making that comparison, it's less likely actually for snow to be able to accumulate on the steeper slopes because it's more likely to slide off than if the slopes were slightly gentler. But once again, we also then have to figure on whether we have hollows or not during an ice age and whether snow can form. Well, if we apply that same logic to the modern day, so how does soil accumulate? Well, soil has to accumulate in flatter areas or in hollows. That then allows certain land uses, forestry and farming, for example, would be a factor. Also, those steeper slopes, as we can see on our north facing, are going to influence drainage. They're going to potentially create more rock slides, which might influence other land uses. Whereas our gentler slopes on our south facing slope over here on our valley, that's going to be the opposite of that. Okay, one final factor worth mentioning. Let's actually think about the land uses that we're seeing here. Now, we're seeing land uses, and especially these ones, and even especially rough grazing, which really reflect Scotland and its climate in general, both today and in the past. So, why do we have rough grazing in Scotland covering huge areas? Why do we have forestry plantations? Well, first of all, it reflects the fact that in the past we had an ice age and we had very cold temperatures because we're quite far north on our planet. And therefore, the ice age had a significant impact on our particular country. Now, why that's relevant in the past is that's why we've ended up with the landscape that we've got and why we've got a lot of U-shaped valleys and a lot of corries and so on and so forth. And of course, if we have a look at the map, we are dealing with a great big ribbon lake in a U-shaped valley, which was created because Scotland experienced the Ice Age. Now, how does that affect land use today? Well, because we've got that landscape was first of all formed during the Ice Age, which is why we have a big loch in the middle. It's also why we've got really steep valley sides. And of course, it's the steepness of the valley sides which is influencing the land uses that we're seeing in this landscape. Similarly, we've also got a landscape with relatively little soil. If you think back to the biosphere topic, you might remember back in higher learning the fact that it takes 500 years for 2 centimeters of soil to form. And in colder climates, it takes even longer for 2 centimeters to form, like the environment we're seeing covered by this map. So there's going to be very little soil, not just because it's a steep slope, but just because soil's not had a chance to form since the last ice age, which is meaning we have a lot of rough grazing, which is what we're seeing. Because there's so little soil that the grass that's growing is pretty poor quality, and all you can put on it is cattle. Whether you are on the north face or the south face, you're pretty limited by the quality of the soil. Okay, and I'll give you an additional point to consider and write about. What's important in this answer, as we've gone through it today, is that you're developing each point, offering a really high degree of explanation. I've made the point of comparing it to corries because that's obviously a theme that you've learned from in the past that helps you understand the difference between north and south facing slopes. But I've also linked every point to the actual question that we've built up to this point.